Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever. Today is Tuesday, December 9th, and it's a great pleasure to have on our program today Julia Tilton, who is a reporter for the Daily Yonder. She reports on climate and energy issues mainly. Daily Yonder is a news organization that, as the name suggests, kind of focuses on issues and stories relevant to rural America. The online publication is based in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and we're really happy to have Julia today with us to tell us about some of her recent stories that she has there and, well, how she wound up working for Daily Yonder. She's based in Portland, Maine, so she's here in our neck of the woods. Julia, welcome to GNET, and thank you very much for making time for this conversation.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about Daily Yonder, just to kind of get us started here. Mainly, the stories I've seen in it are about rural issues. That's primarily its beat, one could say.
Yes, that would be correct. The Daily Yonder is a national nonprofit news organization that's focused on rural America. We've been in this business for some time. We've been around for almost 2 decades and have grown quite a bit since then. We now have staff all over the country, from where I'm at in Portland, Maine, to North Carolina, Texas, Colorado, and Oregon, among other places. And yes, you identified my beat officially is climate and energy. I've learned that it's much more far reaching than it might seem at first glance. Climate and energy involve everything from policy in Washington, D.C., to eroding shorelines in Washington state, and from grassroots activism in Arizona and the Southwest all the way to emergency management in Vermont, in your neck of the woods.
Right. You've written several really interesting stories, which we'll get to talk about in a minute or two. And one of them I did notice was the FEMA response to Vermont's some of our state's recent flooding issues in the last couple of years, and I definitely want to query you about that one as well. But I guess I just wondered how did you wind up reporting for them? You had worked on a podcast for NASA before starting there, and how did that lead you into writing for the Daily Yonder?
So I started last year at the Daily Yonder as a Scripps Howard Fellow. It's an early career journalism program, and have since transitioned to a full-time staff position at the Daily Yonder. When I started, I was still living in Washington, D.C. It was just a few months after I had graduated from college, and I had been interning on NASA's science podcast team, which was a real way to launch into a media career. I feel really fortunate to have cut my teeth with audio production on NASA's science podcast team, Curious Universe. And then when I came over to the Daily Yonder, still living in DC, we were in full swing election season. It was the run up to November 2024. And I ended up doing quite a bit of elections coverage, and elections coverage, particularly through the lens of rural America. But I was always interested in climate change and energy. That had brought me into the internship at NASA, focusing on earth science. I studied earth science and climate in school. And I grew up here in New England, actually, just across the border in New Hampshire. And so I grew up with four seasons. I grew up enjoying the winter time. And I was always really fascinated with our environment and how we interact with our environment, and then also how we power our lives. And of course, that's changing. It's changed over the course of my lifetime, and it will continue to change. And so I moved here to Maine, where I am now, over the summer. My time in Washington, D.C. had run its course, and I wanted to be closer to where the stories are, so to speak. So it's felt like a homecoming of sorts, but it's also really different. And I'm learning and hopefully building trust with folks here on the ground. Maine has a lot of its own dynamics at play, especially when it comes to rural and urban, and sort of where communities blur the lines between rural and urban. And so I'm definitely learning to dig in and appreciate that. But I do, of course, cover stories outside of New England as well because we are a national nonprofit newsroom. We cover all of rural America. That is our charge. And so sometimes the stories are in the mid Atlantic or in the South or on the West Coast. And so when I'm choosing stories and choosing what to cover, I try to find topics, people, places that have a hyperlocal focus, but also a national relevance. And that can be true of a lot of things as I'm continuing to learn.
Yeah, well, those are certainly one of the. That's a kind of a story that I find pretty interesting when you have something that's a local situation going on, but there's a regional or national resonance to it. It's not just a particular, something that happens to be happening in your backyard, but there's an element to that that could be said, well, that's going on in, you know, a lot of different states. It's always interesting to find stories that have that local and much broader aspect to them. With that said, let's talk a little bit about some of the stories that you've written recently. I mean, one of the ones that caught my eye initially was the one about the electric Maine fishing boats. Um, so these are what oyster fishermen that go out, but they're using electric boats now as opposed to gas powered or fossil fuel powered ones. Is that the story?
Yes. So here in Maine and up the coast of Maine, there is a small but mighty cohort of oyster men. So aquaculture farmers, those who are cultivating oysters and other kinds of shellfish for product to sell to restaurants in Portland and Boston and all the way across the country in San Francisco, that are trying to decarbonize their impact. And I thought the story was really interesting because it's one of these places that is on the front lines of the energy transition is sort of the buzzword, right? That we're decarbonizing our operations, we're moving away from fossil fuel sources. But what I found really interesting about this story is that the reason why these oyster farmers and these aquaculture operators are choosing to put electric motors on their fishing boats are not necessarily climate related. Of course, there is this aspect that as an oyster farmer, you are day in, day out on the water. And so your product really depends on the water and the ecosystem being healthy, which would lead you to want to steward that ecosystem. But actually, and I wrote about this in the story, it's about being a good neighbor. So, something that I learned from reporting on the aquaculture industry is that all of the equipment necessary to take up and process oysters from the water is actually really noisy. And here in Maine, there are a lot of people that want to enjoy the coastline, whether for home or for recreation. And so having equipment that is quieter, that's powered by that's electric rather than fossil fuel powered. You can think about how loud a diesel generator is when your power goes out. Having something that's quieter is actually a way to be a better neighbor. And I found that as a really interesting spark for this exploration of these folks really on the front lines of this new climate technology in a place that maybe the rest of the country and even the rest of the world wouldn't quite expect.
Yeah, I agree. One would typically not associate Maine oyster fishing people with being, hyper concerned about climate issues, although that's probably a generalization that's probably unfair and based on limited knowledge on my part. But it's interesting that they have gravitated towards that as a solution to, well, a couple of issues, as you point out. That's really quite cool. The other story you had recently about Maine was about, I think, small scale forest owners earning income by letting their trees grow. I think there was that part of that story that was based in Maine. Tell us a little bit about that. That really was quite intriguing. That yeah, people who own forests can I guess gain some revenue by just leaving the forest there and having a sort of a carbon sequestration dynamic going on.
Yes, that's right. And it's through something called a voluntary carbon market, which is extremely complex. And I will do my best to explain it here in the way that it relates to rural. So, yes, I recently reported a story about these voluntary carbon credit markets, both where I am in Maine and then also in 8 states throughout Appalachia and the Appalachian region. I had the opportunity to actually visit one of the forest woodlots that will be entered into this carbon market here in Maine. It's a 1,600-acre property in Denmark, Maine, which is right across the border from New Hampshire in the White Mountains region. And this property is filled with white pine and oak species that the landowner, Bob Libby, grows to harvest for wood products. And so the idea with the carbon credits is that instead of harvesting the white pine and the oak species every 20 years or every 30 years, Libby will instead adopt specific forest management practices to boost the amount of carbon dioxide that's taken in by those trees over time. And in fact, maybe postpone when the harvests happen. And the principle is actually quite simple. It goes back to what we probably all learned in school, that just like us humans, trees also breathe. So they take in carbon dioxide and actually release oxygen. For humans, it's the opposite. We take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. And so when trees take in that carbon dioxide, there is a process through which over time that carbon can be sequestered. And of course, that's relevant to global climate change because we're emitting carbon dioxide. That's a planet warming greenhouse gas. And so something that can take in that carbon dioxide, again, over time, can have a positive impact on reducing the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. Now, it's complicated when you zoom out to a national or global scale. And I want to note that in addition to this reporting, I think there is a good amount of skepticism due to carbon credit markets. If you Google carbon credits, you'll see headlines that deal with problems with accountability, again, at a global scale, and also criticism that carbon credits give big polluters, think big tech companies that are purchasing carbon credits, a license to continue polluting. And that is maybe all fair and good. I think the reporting that I did focused again at that hyper local level to see where rural landowners are potentially able to enter these markets and make money, or at least hold on to their land for longer periods of time. And so the idea is that a landowner like Bob Libby, who lives in Denmark, might be able to adopt these forest management practices over a 5 or 10 year period. His trees are taking in more carbon, and then he gets paid for that amount of carbon. So the carbon credits are issued per ton of carbon dioxide sequestered. And those carbon credits are purchased by a corporation, an entity, a company somewhere down the line who is trying to either offset their carbon emissions or show the public, the stakeholders, that they are investing in climate action. But on the ground, for someone like Bob Libby, it means that he now has a source of income just by letting his trees grow. And the reason why that's interesting, and in my opinion, something to follow in Maine, is that we, as in many other parts of the country, are dealing with extreme development pressures on rural pieces of land, not only in the agriculture industry, but also in the timber and wood product industry, where folks like Libby, who maybe have had 1,600-acre properties in their family for generations, are now at this point where developing the land is an economically attractive option. And so having another way to make income and even just to pay annual property taxes when there isn't a harvest that year can be a benefit for rural landowners. Or at least that's the hope. I think there will certainly be reporting down the line to see if those promises hold.
Mhm. Because it was interesting, you followed up that story with an interview with a forest economist at Renoster, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's a startup firm that works in with rural communities on establishing those carbon credits. Uh, Was that a sort of a going to be part of the story originally, or did you want, but you wind up doing it separately?
Yes. So I spoke with Mary Ignatiadis. She is a forest economist at Renoster, which is one of these startup carbon developers who are playing the middleman really between these big entities that want to buy carbon credits and the small landowners like a Bob Libby in Maine who are maybe interested in entering the market but don't know how to do it. And Renoster caught my attention because they do have a specific focus on rural and helping rural people access, again, these global or national markets. And so I had this sit down conversation with Mary. She works she works as a forest economist. And so what that means is that she's the person actually doing those really complex calculations to figure out, well, how much carbon can this tree actually take in over a given amount of time? And that's a lot more complicated than it sounds because there are lots of variables to consider. And so, after speaking with Mary and hearing about some of the upcoming projects that Renoster has going on, including here in Maine, I became interested in seeing it for myself and was fortunate to be invited by both Renoster and the landowner to go out to this plot and sort of see how the trees measure up in real time. And as I mentioned, I am sure that there will be more to come as these agreements sort of get signed and more landowners get involved here in the Northeast and then also down in Appalachia.
Wow, that's fascinating. Really interesting. Well, let's turn to that story you had about Vermont and the FEMA funding. We talked about briefly at the top of the show. So yeah, as I'm sure you know, the last 3 years we've had some rather serious flooding happening here in Vermont, all on the same day, July 10th. 3 years in a row, there's been significant rainfall, flooding in parts of the state here, and a few months ago, I guess we learned that FEMA, which had been very helpful in supplying expertise and financing for fixing some of the damages, was what, maybe not going to be as present as had been in the past. Is that what's going on here, or is there something different than that?
Yes, I would say that's a fair characterization. And I actually think this story is the perfect example of that kind of local meets national story, in that the back and forth between the state of Vermont and FEMA and the Trump administration is really emblematic of what many states and then rural communities are facing under the Trump administration and the Trump administration's changes to FEMA. Under Trump's FEMA, there has been a real slow roll of emergency response, and that the agency is now taking longer to respond to and approve disaster declaration requests. Those are what come in from state governors. And in order for a state to access federal disaster response dollars, the president and FEMA need to approve those disaster declaration requests in order to unlock that funding. So in Vermont, I spent some time in Brattleboro and Ludlow over the summer, reporting on the aftermath of those floods that you mentioned, and then recovery, actually dating back to Hurricane Irene in 2011. And I followed how federal disaster dollars have been put to work in the past to make rural communities more resilient to future storms. In Brattleboro, I looked specifically at how several floodplains were restored following Irene back in 2011. And what was interesting, and I actually was able to do some filming while I was on the ground there, to put a visual to some of this. But in the storms since Irene, particularly the severe rain over the past couple of summers, the floodplains that have been restored in Brattleboro have actually worked like they're supposed to, in diffusing the energy and the floodwaters upstream so that they don't cause as much damage to buildings and property and people downstream. There are also a number of larger culverts that have been installed in Brattleboro under bridges that help, again, channel the water so that it doesn't flood and cause damage to buildings. But the challenge is that all of this infrastructure that I followed and had the chance to observe up close is made possible through the federal government funding from FEMA. And those pools of money, namely the Public Assistance Fund and then the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP, are being dramatically altered under the Trump administration. And what that means in practice is that the money is much harder for communities like Brattleboro and Ludlow to access. And just a note on this, that I, as part of this reporting, spoke to the regional planning commissioners in both Brattleboro and Ludlow, and they both told me that even under normal circumstances, so forget sort of the Trump administration's upheaval to FEMA and how FEMA administers funding, even under a regular scenario, it's still difficult for rural communities to access federal dollars due to lack of capacity. Oftentimes, rural communities don't have full-time grant writers. They have people that wear 3 or 4 different hats in their local government. And so finding the time and the capacity to apply for that funding and then put it into motion and actually do some of the resilience projects can be incredibly difficult and expensive. So the situation that's happening in Washington, D.C. now is just exacerbating all of those existing strains on this disaster response system.
Yeah, that's very similar to what I heard from local officials around here in the wake of some of those storms. That it was there was a lot of paperwork involved with trying to get support and help from FEMA. Uh, one local community here had the great good fortune of having someone who had worked, I guess, had worked for FEMA or was very familiar with it, kind of knew the shortcuts and how to get things going, and they were able to get their financial request into their treasury very quickly and able to spend that money and make some of the repairs and fixes to some of the roads and bridges that had been damaged in the flood. And I remember hearing the one of the town officials saying we were just really lucky we had this guy who kind of knew how to work things around the corners. But it's just despite the fact that so many I heard so many complaints about FEMA takes so long, we got to do this, we got to do that. I mean, clearly that was a better situation than what seems to be going on at the moment. I mean, that's better than not getting any money at all because some of the damage is so severe that there's no way local communities can afford to fix it out of their own, property tax revenue or other sources of money that they might have. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, certainly. And just one other thing that I learned while reporting this story, that Vermont has such a high number, I believe it's close to 200 or maybe just over 200 communities, that each community then has its own person responsible for disaster response, for writing grants. And if you think about the taxpayer base in each of those local communities, it just becomes impossible when an entire community's budget is, say, $1 million, and replacing 1 or 2 culverts is going to be $1.5 million. So it very quickly becomes clear where the federal government's role comes in. But of course, with the upheaval right now in Washington, D.C., it's unclear what the future holds.
Um, I was wondering, you also did a story, an interview with a small newspaper editor that I really want to, hear some more about. But I guess before we get to that, I wondered, as you go around rural America, um, and look at some of the issues they face, even if it's largely through a climate or energy focus. Um, I mean, one of the issues I've heard over and over again in recent years is that rural America in general not just rural New England, but across the country. It seems to be going through a period of struggle, I guess. Populations are declining. It seems like they don't seem to be the kind of places where a lot of younger folks, in particular, see opportunities to kind of you know get ahead or get high-paying jobs. I mean, is there? Are you getting a sense that there's sort of a way that rural communities can sort of, I'm not sure if rebound is the word, but at least sort of begin to see growth through some opportunities or another that might come along, or is it just a case where they seem to be really stuck in kind of a no growth situation, and the whole population and economic issues are just going to be with us for a while longer?
Yeah, so my perspective on this, again, through the lens of the climate and energy reporting that I've done, is that I still think that showing up locally matters. And where I have seen rural communities succeed in their efforts or their goals tends to be when they show up together, and for one another, often in a kind of grassroots way. And I think this is also not a political thing. This is not left or right. This is communities showing up together for one another across the political aisle. And interestingly, issues at the hyper local level often do cut across the ideological spectrum. And by this, I can reference a specific story I did earlier this year in Southwest Virginia, where a community came together in very organized opposition to a data center development that would have been the largest gas powered data center in the United States. And this community came together, banded together at the hyper local level to get their county board of supervisors to reject the development's proposal to rezone the land for industry. And so that's an example of this very hot topic nationally. We are hearing more and more about data centers and data center developments really being decided by rural people having the decision in their own hands. And so I think that you can see success in small pockets, and it is where people show up together. And so I think what was maybe surprising to me at first, is the fact that there are these local groups that are able to affect change at the local level, because what's happening in your own backyard is often decided in your own backyard. And so I'm talking about, your town council or your county board of supervisors. And so in order for those decisions to be made in the way that you and your community want them to be made, it takes showing up, being there, and then building on that. And so across the country, not just in Southwest Virginia, but in other places in Arizona outside of Tucson, I'm beginning to see more communities, more rural communities take note of that and start to petition for changes, whether it's on zoning, for data centers or cost of living, or other matters in their own communities.
I'm fascinated. Why were those folks in that community opposed to the data center? But you would think on the face of it, that's jobs, that's more money coming in one way or another. Why did they not want to have it there?
So the number one reason for opposition in that particular instance, in this was in Pittsylvania County in Southwest Virginia, it's right on the border of North Carolina, was that the data center was going to be powered by natural gas turbines that would have emitted a particular kind of pollution called particulate matter pollution, that is known to be cancer causing and is actually, the EPA has guidance that there is no safe level of particulate matter pollution. And so once this community got wind of this sort of massive industrial change to what was primarily an agrarian community, they felt that that was not the right opportunity. Never mind if it brought some kind of development to their county. And on the economic development piece, because this is a part of the data center center development and a part of the data center puzzle that gets sort of broadcast a lot, that data centers can bring economic development to particularly to rural communities. But the fact is that while there are some jobs associated with construction of data centers, oftentimes the maintenance and sort of permanent jobs that result from data centers being built are few and far between, and sometimes require skilled labor, excuse me, that folks in rural communities might not have. And so the lasting number of jobs that come from data center developments are often not enough in rural communities' eyes to sort of suffice the electricity, the water usage, and also the land use change resulting from those developments being built.
Mm, fascinating. Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. Well, we just have a minute or two left, and before we have to run, I just wanted to definitely ask you a little bit about that interview you did with the editor of a small town newspaper in Maine. That was of great interest to me as a former small town editor. Um, Small town papers are struggling a lot. Great questions about their ability to kind of survive and make their way in the ever evolving landscape of news media, technology, and all of that, bringing big changes to the way things used to be done. At the same time, I think a lot of people also began to realize how important small town local newspapers are. They're generally speaking, anyway, I think a trusted source of information for their communities, where people can learn about everything from the high school basketball team's success or failures to what the town council is doing, and everything in between. This conversation with this editor, he seemed to be fairly optimistic that there was a place that publication was going to be able to find a way to, you know, do its job and hang around for a while.
Certainly, he was an optimist. And yes, I spoke with Alex Seitzwald, who is an editor for the Midcoast Villager, which serves the rural Knox and Waldo counties in the midcoast of Maine, so just north of me. And he certainly had an interesting take on the future of news media and particularly in small communities and rural communities, at least here in Maine. What caught my attention about the Midcoast Villager is that it has somewhat of an innovative strategy for bringing in revenue. The bottom floor of the Midcoast Villager's newsroom building is a fully functional cafe that serves breakfast and lunch, and also the print newspaper. So the Midcoast Villager, you can find it online, but it's also a print newspaper. It goes to print once a week. And right where you order your coffee, you can also pick up a copy of the newspaper. And so, what I found interesting about Seitzwald's strategy with the newspaper and the community engagement is that this cafe, in addition to bringing in revenue for the newspaper, also serves as one of those third places that rural communities are often lacking, right? So, a public space, a community hub for readers of the newspaper to come in and argue with the editors about what was in that week's issue or ask questions. And I think the byproduct of that, and what was interesting and maybe borne out in our conversation, is that having those spaces, those opportunities for interaction, really does build trust with local media at a time when trust in media is at an all-time low.
Mm.
And so one line that I'll just pick on here from that conversation that has certainly resonated with me in respect to covering local communities and why that coverage is important. And of course, we just spoke about how decisions about our backyards are often made in our own backyards. Alex Seitzwald, before moving to Maine, lived in Washington, D.C., and was a correspondent for NBC News, obviously a big legacy newsroom. And he spoke to me about how when he was working for NBC and covering a presidential debate, there was no risk that that debate was going to go uncovered if he didn't show up, right? There would be dozens, maybe over 100 other journalists at that presidential debate, making sure that the news made it to people across the country. But in Knox County, Maine, there might not be another reporter at that county board of supervisors or town council meeting. And so showing up in those spaces is arguably even more important to inform people what's happening again in their own backyards. And I found that to be quite resonant, particularly as we think about how the media ecosystem is evolving and what it might look like, not just a year in the future, but 5, 10 years into the future.
Yeah, that idea about having a little cafe there by your newsroom struck me like, oh my God, that is brilliant. I mean, talk about how to get ideas for stories coming in. People just come in and say, tell you, hey, did you hear about this or that? I remember when I was the editor of the paper around here, at one point there was one of the local post office branches was closing, and we had this idea, well, maybe we could be like sort of the post office drop off point and have all these people coming in and we would find out what's going on and what stories we want to run out and cover. And that didn't work out, but which is probably a good thing, actually. But it reminded me of that's kind of the sort of way to really integrate yourself even more into your local community. A really brilliant idea, and one I'm sure that will be copied many times over, or should be anyway. Well, gosh, Julia, there's so many other things we could be chatting about, but I guess we're going to have to leave it there for today. But thank you very much for making the time for this. It's really quite fascinating, and the work you're doing is really, really great. Now, people want to start reading the Daily Yonder. They just go online, right? Google Daily Yonder or whatever, and the website will come up, and they can start checking out all the work that you've been doing and your colleagues as well.
That's right. You can find us at dailyyonder.com.
All right. Well, it doesn't get much easier than that. All right. Well, great. Thanks again, Julia. Really appreciate your time, and I'll look forward to your next story.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right. And thanks to all of you who've been with us. Hope you found the program interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Take care.